Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 310. I'm joined by my co-host, Jordan Tyrer. Jordan, how are we?
Good, thanks. Nice to be back.
There's been a big shift in the weather because we both now have long sleeve tops on, so you can see that what's going on in the UK right now. We are joined, very excited about this one today because we always talk about learning from different sports and seeing how different organisations work differently. And we're definitely going to get an insight into that today. Matthew Innes has joined us. So, Matthew, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ben and Jordan. It's good to be here.
Thank you, mate. No, I appreciate it. We always start in the same way on these episodes, and that is you and your background. So, can you give us a little bit of insight into your career so far?
Yeah, born and bred in Australia, so not far from Melbourne. So as a youngster, always played sport. Anyone that's grown up around Melbourne always plays Australian football in winter, cricket in summer. So that's what I did. I played both of those. I was decent at both. Had to make a choice of whether I wanted to try and be a professional in either one of those. So I decided to be a cricketer. So I was a fast bowler back in the day. So I had a professional cricket career. Luckily or unluckily, I was around in Australia's greatest era, I suppose, when they had anyone that knows cricket, Glenn McGrath, Brett Lee, Jason Gillespie, these guys. So I never really got an opportunity at the high level, but yeah, had about 12 years professionally, come over and play county cricket for a year at Northamptonshire. And then during my cricket career, I had always had an interest in strength and conditioning, bit of coaching as well. So I was sort of going down both paths, not sure which one I do. And then I retired reasonably young. So I was 30 when I retired from cricket, had enough of it. Moved into fast bowling coaching with the WA cricket team and also strength and conditioning. So I was doing that back then for a few years. Still not sure whether I go down the high performance path or the coaching path. The high performance path interests me more. So I moved, so I was in cricket for 3 or 4 years as a strength and conditioning coach, then moved into Australian football. So for those who don't know Australian football, it's the biggest sport in Australia, a really demanding sport on the athletes. So it's a great one for us to be involved in. So I got a job with the Western Bulldogs, which is one of the teams in the AFL. Did a PhD through the Western Bulldogs, working in their high performance department. And then a couple of years into that, I got the role as high performance manager, which is, I guess, the same as your director of performance in England. So I rolled out at the Western Bulldogs doing that in about 2015. And then at the same time as that, I got involved with Olympic track cycling. So we had a group, the Malaysian track cycling team, who were based in Melbourne, actually. We were training them, had a few really good athletes who have been to the last couple of Olympics. We had a guy that won silver in Tokyo, Malaysia's best ever result in any sport, which was great. And then he crashed out in the Paris Olympics, didn't get a medal. But so I was with the Malaysian track cycling team for that period of time. So I've been with the Western Bulldogs for 12 years all up. And then this time last year, I got a opportunity to change clubs to West Coast Eagles, which is a really big club, but had probably been underperforming for the last couple of years. So finished on the bottom of the ladder last year. Really big, successful club previously, probably the biggest club in Australia, but really underperforming for the last couple of years. So this time last year, I made the move over to West Coast, and I've been there for the last 12 months in the same role. Doing an MBA as well, so that keeps me a bit busy as well. So we've got about another 6 months of that to go, and I'll finish that. So yeah, that's a bit of a brief snapshot of me.
Awesome, mate. No, I'm really excited to dive into your experiences in the different sports, and obviously there's very different demands on those athletes that you mentioned. But yeah, massive lessons to learn. Just on your experience in cricket and going back as a player, what was you said that you got obviously interested into S&C and sort of physical performance and what you could do off the pitch, but was there an immediate buy-in from yourself and maybe some of your teammates in the importance of S&C, or was that developed over time?
I was probably always knew the importance of it. I guess also playing Australian rules football, which is a demanding sport. So, having played both growing up, I knew the importance of, I guess, physical performance. So that helped me from a young age. And being a fast bowler as well, it's pretty demanding being a fast bowler. So I bought into it pretty young. not all cricketers did. Batsmen in particular, it's such a skill-based sport that you probably can get away with not being as physically, I guess, competent as some other sports. But fast bowling, you really can't get away with it. So I guess always had an interest in it. And then when I retired, I was lucky I went into the same team that I was an athlete with. So just great timing. So then they all understood that my philosophy around it. So it actually helped buy in from the players I was working with. So I went from playing in the team to literally the next day telling these guys what to do. So it was an interesting transition.
And how was that? Did that take a little bit of time for them to sort of see that switch of caps or?
Yeah, I think so. Like any ex-athlete, you sort of still think you're an athlete for a period of time. And because I was only 30, I could do what the athletes could do. So it took a while for me to, I guess, move from athlete into staff member from a relationships point of view. I was really good mates with a lot of them, but also from I guess, a work ethic point of view, because you're still in the athlete work ethic as opposed to the staff member work ethic. So it probably took a year or two to actually make that transition, I reckon.
Oh, brilliant. No, it's interesting, Jordan, isn't it? Because that's in terms of that initial battle, like we just mentioned, with like Matt talked about the batsman being more technical. It's something that we spoke about with football in terms of that initial buy-in from certain players. You get the more technical players that maybe aren't focusing so much on the gym and because they've got that technical side. So there's a comparison there straight away, isn't there?
100%. And I think actually the point Matt made there is really important in terms of transitioning from a player to coach, because anyone who's worked at clubs, you probably would have come across ex-pros who have gone into coaching, and very rare do you see them just, literally switch like that. Certainly if they've really like soon retired from playing and going straight into coaching, you can just see like their technical knowledge is unbelievable because they're still, like Matt said, in the game, if you like. But that coaching is such a different skill. And you can see it's getting the knowledge from here and into the understanding of the players and things like that. So I think that's really important. Certainly from an S&C point of view, I think that's such a massive advantage you would have had, Matt, because you obviously played at the highest level, and potentially younger players coming through are going, oh, I want to be like him. And then you've just got somebody who can go, yeah, well, make sure you're doing this in the gym. This really helped me. My shoulder strengthening rehab routine every single day really helped me.
Yeah.
And they go, okay, cool, I'll do that then. And then you've won every battle you pretty much ever have as an S&C coach there. So that must have been really useful for working with young players.
It was. I guess you start from a higher starting point, and then but it's pretty quick before they forget you're a player. So you start from that point of view, but then pretty quickly they realize that, all right, what can they actually do for me? So yeah, it is important, I guess, and that's where I was lucky the first year or so, had really strong relationships with, and I think you're a product of your past, and a lot of that stuff, even with me now, is a product of me being an athlete and knowing the importance of building relationships with athletes, because I could do it straight away my first year out. I saw the importance of it to help athlete buy-in. So it's something I still try and do and build that relationship with the athletes. So when they see how much you care about them and want to try and make them get better, I think that's pretty important as well.
Just on that though as well, because you mentioned about obviously not just being a teammate, but also being a mate as well. So how was that sort of transition? Because we've said before again on the podcast that some people it's fine to have that relationship, but you need to know there's got to be a line there as well, hasn't there? So how was that from you being teammate and friends to then having to maybe set that line a little bit more?
Yeah, and I think that's the hard thing. It did take probably a year or two, as I mentioned before, to transition into that, because I was the same age, or I was even younger than some of the athletes. So to make that transition, it did take a while. I guess I was pretty lucky that when I was playing, I was pretty ruthless with some of them as well. So it didn't take that much to change that type of mindset. If you're mates with them when you're playing, and then all of a sudden you change your character when you finish playing into to being this hard ass who's ruthless on the players, and that's different. But because I was holding them account when I was playing, I guess I found it a little bit easier from that point of view. But I think that in terms of the relationship part, I reckon a lot of it's the follow up. You need to be able to have that hard conversation, as we all do, but it's how you follow up from that. So I think it's people talk about honesty and there's brutal honesty, but there's honesty with compassion as well. So if you can, I think I'll try and display honesty with compassion. So you have to be honest, you have to hold them to account, but then off the back of that, it's how you follow up the next day or the next conversation you have with them and say, right, do you understand what I meant? And just so you're not just leaving them with that brutal honesty and then you don't know how they've handled it, if that makes sense.
I think that's a great point, because I think going too far in either direction from that, it'll turn into a struggle, won't it? Because if it's just honesty without the compassion and you basically just dictating or being far too stern, players are probably gonna rub a lot of players up the wrong way. Whereas
Yeah.
the other side is an issue as well, isn't it? If you go too compassionate and there's not any honesty involved in it, then there's an issue there as well. So that I feel like the balance is key, isn't it, with that?
Yeah, I think it's the reason for the honesty. So I think brutal honesty is to sometimes people do it to make themselves feel better, but it
Yeah.
actually makes the athlete feel worse. So, whereas if you just, I guess, go around the subject and aren't honest with the athlete, you're not doing them a favor either. So you need to think about why you're being honest, and you're honest to try and help the athlete get better and make the environment better. So if you always think about that and think about you're actually being honest with the behavior, not the person. So if you're criticizing their behavior or you're criticizing that type of thing rather than criticizing the person, I think that's the distinguishing part as well. So the compassion behind it's pretty vital.
And that's so different person to person as well, isn't it? Because you just sat in a changing room with players where you could probably have a conversation with one that you definitely couldn't have with another, and likewise working across a changing room. So I think that's the other important thing, isn't it? Is knowing how to speak to individuals.
Yeah, exactly. I think part of that is one of my philosophies is trying to have a lot of really small conversations regularly, which makes the big hard conversation easier to have. If you don't speak to people regularly, especially in our type of role, when you go up and talk to them, they're going to think, oh, what's he got to say? He's going to have a crack in the here. So if I approach someone, I see that they start to get on the back foot. Well, I know I'm not having enough smaller conversations with that person to make the bigger, harder conversations easier to have.
Oh, great point. That's something that Barry Druss spoke about, Jordan, with us, wasn't it? In terms of the touch points. Can you remember how many it was? So Barry presented for us, Matt, at one of our events that we did. And he spoke about coaches having a certain amount of touch points with a player per day. I think it was, wasn't it? Obviously, that can go one way or the other in terms of being positive or being not so positive. But that's essentially what he was referring to, wasn't it, in terms of those small conversations?
Yeah, I can't remember what the figure was, but I think that's a great point Max just made there for anyone listening, but certainly younger practitioners, is that, again, we come back to it all the time. The technical knowledge you have, it's worthless if you can't, adapt how you present it to each player. And again, just doing it as a squad or as a whole changing room or, on the pitch during the warm up, trying to tell them all that information is going to be taken differently by every single athlete. Certainly in a gym environment, if you're going, right, lads, we really need to push it today, like, I really want you to get the intensity in there. You might think, everyone would have listened to that, but some of them would have just switched off straight away and they'll have just gone through the motions because they're thinking about something else or they've got something going on at home. So I think that's such a great point in terms of this little conversations. And again, I think it's the importance as well, isn't it, that the role of an S&C coach, physical performance coach, whatever it might be, it's not the same as a head coach. It never will be. And certainly it's not the same as a player. And it's somewhere, I've always pictured it as somewhere in between. I've always said we kind of do have to play the bit of the big brother role from now and then, when you can put an arm around, but at the same time you can go, come on, that's rubbish. Come on, get on with it now. And I think how you put it there in terms of being brutally honest is for yourself, not necessarily for them, but then you've also got to have the right level of honesty to actually kick them on a little bit. I think that's a really, really good point. So very, very good. If anyone's listening to that, take that on board. Give you my advice.
Matt,
That's exactly right.
We've spoke just before we started recording about some of the differences with head coaches, and that in football and especially in England, it seems there's a lot of changeover throughout even a season. Whereas you mentioned before that in the AFL, it seems to be that coaches are in positions for longer. But what I wanted to, and obviously you can touch on that in a second, but what I wanted to talk about was we were going to speak about change at an organization, which obviously over here we're probably a bit more used to because of that nature. But with yourselves, like that must be an even bigger thing in terms of a change of organization, change of philosophy, change of personality of someone coming into an organization. So what's the sort of thoughts around that? What's the approach that you take to somebody new coming in?
Yeah. So, yeah, as mentioned before, we can talk about the head coaches in a second, but I guess the club I'm at the moment, I've been there for 12 months. I was at my previous club for 12 years. So I've came to West Coast replacing someone that had been in my role for 15 years. So, really good guy, been really successful. I've got a really strong relationship with him. You get to know everyone in the AFL because he's been around for a while. So he'd been there 15 years. I've got three or four staff that have been at the club for over 10 years. The coach has been there for, I think, 10 to 12 years. The footy manager has been there for 15. So really, really stable club, which is great. Because in Perth, which is the club, that's where it is, the West Coast Eagles. It's the most isolated city in the world. It's a 4 hour plane flight from the eastern states, so it's a long way away. So it's a stable club, but it can get a bit. It's a traditional club as well because it's so isolated. So trying to come into a new organisation who hadn't been going as well as they liked over the last couple of years, trying to make that change. So it was an interesting process for me, replacing someone they all respected. So you need to make sure you respect that person as well. You don't want to come in and they've obviously got really strong relationships with people. So it's how you manage that change and making the people realize you need to change. So yeah, after being on the bottom of the ladder last year, second bottom the previous year, so it was pretty clear we needed to change. So basically, what I did was when I first started, had a good listen to what everyone thought had worked over the last couple of years, but what hadn't. It was pretty clear that there was things that hadn't. Had a pretty bad run with injury. There was times when the team struggled to field the team. So there's obviously an issue there with a lot of that's contact injury. So there's some things you can't do anything about, but trying to find out what the staff that were there previously thought, trying to find out what worked, what didn't. Then from there, I guess molded my philosophy on top of that. So tell the staff what I stand for as a high performance manager. And the really good thing is what they thought we needed to change was things that I align with as well. So then after hearing what they thought, what I thought, I actually started to sell my philosophy as to this is actually your philosophy as well, because this is things that you've developed, things that you've seen to try and make them buy into it. If I tell them what I think, then they're not going to buy into the philosophy as well because it's not theirs. So part of it was actually making them feel like it was their idea and their philosophy as well, which in essence it was. So so that was the first step in it. The second step, because we're going to make some change, so try and make it, I guess, urgent. Okay, it's urgent. We make these changes. Trying and get everyone along for the ride by making them buy into it. And then also highlighting the risks involved with it. Okay, so we're going to go in this path. Are we happy with this? And everyone said, yep, we need to do this. All right, so what are the risks involved with it? Well, we're going to change the way we train. There's a lot of stuff going on here. The risks are we might get as many injuries as we've had in the past. Are we willing to accept that risk? We mightn't perform as well. So try and highlight the risk or the potential risk before they happen. So then down the path, if these things start to rear their heads, rather than people being really worried about it, you can actually refer back to what you spoke about a month or two ago and say, right, this is what we spoke about. We knew this is a possibility, and we're still happy to go in this path. And everyone said, yep, we're happy to go in this path. So it was almost the buy-in that we had was really important. And then that helps. So when you get small wins along the way, you celebrate the small wins to make the change seem like it's working. So there's a model, I think it's an 8-step Potter. I think Potter had an 8-step model, which I learned from the NBA actually. Talks about how to implement change. It's about celebrating small wins along the way, getting people along for the ride, and then embedding that change into the organization.
That. Yeah, I love that because that's really important because we speak to a lot of coaches, like I mentioned, within football that move a lot, and whether that's moving into a new club or whether that's a new coach coming in. So they're going to be dealing with this more regularly. So I think that's a great point to put over. But I love the fact of speaking and getting feedback and then sort of meeting your philosophy and theirs somewhere in the middle. I think that's such a great point, John, isn't it? Because again, we're speaking to coaches previously on the podcast, that it's kind of what they've done, but probably not as structured as what Matt's talked about there.
Yeah, and I think the important bit and the elephant in the room is that Matt's been allowed time to do that. And let's face it, football is nuts for hiring and firing. I think everyone would rather it was more stable. I don't know anyone who's like, yeah, no, I love the chopping and changing. So I think actually it just shows, doesn't it, by allowing, if you're going into a role knowing that you're more than likely going to have a lot of stability, it almost puts you a little bit at ease that you can go, right, I can sit back and I can listen to the feedback of what people have thought who've been in the building a lot longer than me. What are their views? Because they're in the early stages there and throughout, their views are going to be so critical because they've got probably the best flavour of the environment. So you need to know, so you can take your time to listen. Whereas I think in football, in this country, certainly it's a little bit of like, I want to listen, I do want to do all those right things, but I know that if the first 5 results go against us and we have 4 hammy injuries and 2 ACLs in the first 5 matches, they're probably going to look at the head of performance if you're going in that role, or S&C coach, whatever it might be, and go, what have you changed? What have you done? And if you've gone in and ripped the rule book up from day one and gone, right, forget everything you know, we're completely changing the training, we're doing everything, this, that, the other. We spoke about in the last one, didn't we? With the Pompey guys, in terms of finding the right time to implement change. If you're going in from day one and just chopping and changing straight away, A, it's going to probably upset the rhythm of the place, and B, it might actually have knock-on consequences for the players. So, you've almost got to sit back and have time, but we just know with the hiring and firing in the UK that sometimes you don't have that time. So it's almost like a call to actually have patience. But some of the podcasts we've had, I mean, Paul White's one was really good. Going out to Saudi and saying, actually, he said the same thing, sat back, listened, got the feedback. And I think that's an important point for people listening, certainly if they're going into those sorts of roles. First day in the role, it's not about you. It's about the others and finding as much information and gathering as much information as you can. And then the question to you, Matt, is, I'm pretty sure they were, but how receptive were the staff in terms of the philosophy when you were saying, actually, we really align now? I'm guessing straight away that buy-in was there because they said, oh yeah, well, we think needs to change. It's the same thing that you're saying, and off we go, really, really positively. How did that kind of go first stages?
Yeah, it went. It did go well. So I think I come at a good time when I think everyone realised that we needed a change based off finishing on the bottom of the ladder, bottom 2 for the last 2 years, and the last couple of years had been really bad from an injury point of view. So I think they realised we needed to change, and we come up with a couple of key themes that we wanted to try and implement as a group. And again, I tried to make them own those themes as much as me telling them. So we wanted to try and have a risk-taking philosophy, but we wanted to have calculated, not reckless risks. So everyone says, yeah, we're happy to take risks, where, there's no blame, all this type of thing until something goes wrong. So the way I tried to get around that was, I'll hold you to account if it's a reckless risk. If it's a calculated risk and you've actually thought through it and on the balance of probability, you think, yep, this is a risk that we're willing to take, and we've collaborated and we've discussed it. If something goes wrong, then that's something we've all owned. Whereas if it's a risk that if you play someone off a hamstring and he hasn't run above 90% max, well, that's a reckless risk in my thought. So the difference between calculated and reckless we're really strong on. So we had a couple of really key themes that we wanted to try and implement, which we did. And then the other thing, as I mentioned at the start, was, right, we need to also realise what the implications of this could be. And the implications could be that we're going to change, we're going to run faster, more often, all these type of things. Well, the risk is we might have more soft tissue injury. So we had to do it carefully. So for me, it was, and you're right, we have a bit more time, but I started 2 weeks before pre-season started. So I had 2 weeks to try and gather this information, try and mold my philosophy with the team's philosophy. And then our pre-season's a bit longer than what yours is as well. So we had time to try and take our time over the first week or two to make sure it worked.
I think it's such a good point in terms of bringing up those risks from the start, isn't it? Because it's fine to say, these are the things we need to change. These are the changes we can make. But we all know within any sort of change, there's going to be the risk side of it as well. And those
Yeah.
differences between the reckless and calculated, I think, are crucial. But it's maybe something that people don't want to bring up because they don't want to make it seem as like a negative. But highlighting those and putting a plan in place of saying this is the risk and this is the action we could potentially take if that risk occurs, you're covering all bases, aren't you? You're ready as a
Yeah.
department then to deal with what's ahead.
Yeah. Well, we had a couple of instances. We had a guy come back from the ACL, did an ACL last year. So to me, it's if we had bring him back 4 or 5 weeks early, to me that we hadn't done hadn't ticked every single box we needed him to tick. So to me, that would have been a reckless risk. Whereas a player who had a no soft tissue history, had a grade 1 hamstring, in a low risk area of recurrence, we thought, oh, that's a calculated risk. We're going to roll the dice on that one. So I guess the difference between, and if it come, I guess we use a bit of a risk matrix as well, where you look at the likelihood of it going wrong and the outcome if it does go wrong. So if the likelihood of it going wrong is catastrophic, well, then that's a reckless risk. Where if the likelihood of it going wrong is it's only a minor implication, then we're more likely to take that risk. So you look at the likelihood of it, of the outcome and what the implications of the outcome are, and you can see what the risk, what it is there.
With those conversations, sorry, Jordan, I was just going to say, with those conversations that you're having then, is that as a sort of physical performance department, or does that include like the more technical staff as well, maybe head coach, or who's included in that sort of conversation?
So we'll have a meeting. So in season, let's just say we'll have a meeting early in the week once we've got all our information from the previous week as a performance department. We'll go through, have a really in-depth discussion of the lists, and then off the back of that, we'll go to the coaches with, I guess, when we leave our room from the performance department, we're pretty clear on what we think. There might be 1 or 2 players there who we want the coach's input with. And then those 1 or 2 players that we go to the coach with, they're ones that we're tossing up, and we'll go to them with the implications or the risk of if this player plays, this could be the outcome, and then get the coaches and the players input into that decision making.
Sorry,
John, I cut you off.
No, I was going to say we're clearly in sync because that was the exact question I was going to ask. Is how does it? Yeah, it's amazing that. I was going to say basically it just shows the power of communication, doesn't it? Because as a department, you're having to get everyone's opinion to best calculate that risk reward ratio. So I think I was I'm glad you asked that question. But the one thing I wanted to ask earlier, actually, to be fair, is obviously people who aren't familiar with AFL might not be fully aware of the physicality, but also the likelihood of quite a lot high intensity injuries, which might have long impacts in terms of their rehab time. So, what's sort of your approach? I know you can't probably sum it up on a podcast. You probably take a week to kind of go over how you're trying to prevent, high grade hamstrings and ACL tears. But what's your sort of philosophy summarized so that the listeners can kind of steal a few tidbits from you?
Yeah. I guess to start with, you look at the game. So the game, for those that haven't seen it, they're pretty phenomenal athletes. They need speed, power, endurance, skill. So we get guys that cover over 15 kilometers in the game. A lot of that, so 3 kilometers of that's going to be at a high speed. Probably for the quicker guys, 700 or 800 meters of the sprint, 140, 145 meters a minute for the game time. So it's a pretty phenomenal. So that's just from a physical point of view. The accel, decel, change of direction, the tackling. So it's rugby tackling. It's not football tackling. So proper like tackling. So you need upper body strength. You need power plus the skill. So it's a pretty plus the tactical sense as well. So it's a pretty phenomenal game for the athletes to have to play. So knowing all that, it's about the preparation that we need to put the athletes into. So for me, it's about exposure to the game demands, I suppose, like every sport would be. So I'm pretty big on making sure we go above the game demands, like everyone is. High speed. So I'm really big on the high speed. So we'll tick on above in pre-season. We'll try and go above 90% twice a week. I don't want to go necessarily more than twice a week. We only play 1 game a week as well, which helps. So we play 1 game a week, so we prepare them for that. But in pre-season, we might have the Monday and the Friday, the bigger sessions, try and build those sessions up to be above 15 Ks in volume with high speed, above 90%, high football demands, high change direction, accel, decel, all that type of stuff in the Monday and the Friday. The Wednesday for me, some people in my role are different. For me, it's more of a skill development day, more of an endurance type day. And then we'll do a bit of a flush run on the Saturday. So it's 4 times a week where they're running. Monday and the Friday are the really big sessions where I want high intensity, high volume, high speed to try and make them as robust as I can. So there's nothing groundbreaking there, but it's just the amount of volume that and the high speed that they need to do. So I'm sure in the EPL, you've got guys who probably cover more high speed than what our guys do. That's it's the endurance and all that type of stuff that's probably a bit more than what some of the EPL guys would do. But overall, it's just trying to get them ready for the game, knowing what they have to do.
Yeah, there's a lot there to prepare them for, isn't it? Sorry, Matt, in terms of your game day, is that Sunday then?
So a game day changes. So it's once a week, but the fixture is either most teams will play. There's one game Friday night, and the rest of them are either Saturday or Sunday. So you'll generally have either 6, 7, or 8 day breaks between each game.
Yeah, because that is obviously the biggest challenge that a lot of coaches will face, and certainly in the what we've been dealing with Football League and Premier League is that you'll get clubs that are on a sort of Saturday, Tuesday, Saturday, and some. I mean, as it gets into the season even further, you get even more sort of congested fixture periods. But that is a big challenge to face, isn't it, in terms of that preparation, John?
Yeah, and there's some serious numbers in terms of 15K and multiple Ks of high speed running and 700, 800 meters of sprint is some serious numbers, and it just shows. I think if I know you have to have a different slightly game or longer games to match that in a football match, but you couldn't do that. I genuinely don't think you could do that on like you say, a Saturday, Tuesday, Saturday, and certainly the Christmas period. Like Steve was saying, the Pompey boys, like when you go in 26th, 28th, 30th, or 31st, that Christmas festive period is just absolute bonkers, and yet you're expecting players to still hit those match demands, and they just physically don't have the recovery time. So, yeah, I think it's a really good point, isn't it? That we look at different sports, and this is why we wanted to get you on that, because it allows us to have a little look at our own, matches and our own sport in terms of the demands, because the AFL guys are going through such high demands, but they're allowed 6, 7, maybe even 8 days of recovery consistently, and actually they're allowed to go again, and they can go again, and they go again. Whereas in the Premier League and the EFL, it isn't like that. So it's kind of like maybe a little moment to look at what we're doing in this country. But I think, in terms of those match demands, though, has that changed over the years? Because obviously with football in this country, the match demands are increasing. Are you finding now with better strength and conditioning, better investment in terms of departments and sports and performance departments, are the demands in the EFL also increasing? Let's say 10 years ago, were they only covering 12K, that sort of thing?
I think the biggest change has been there's been a lot of rule changes. The AFL changed the rules to try and make the game faster. So I think the high speed numbers have gone up. The volumes are pretty similar. If anything, the meters per minute have slowly gone down. So when I say above 140 meters per minute, there's probably a couple of players per team that will average that. So the meters per minute's slowly gone down, I think because of the high speed nature of the game. So we probably average about 130 meters per minute now, whereas a few years ago it was probably 135. So that's gone down, but the sprint numbers have definitely gone up. So and I think part of it is the training, but I think the other part is the rules that they've put in place.
What do you tend to get in terms of the athletes that you're dealing with now, Matt? Have they, like yourself, generally been multi-sport athletes up to a certain age and then committed to sort of AFL, or like what's the sort of background? I know it's going to differ player to player, but generally, what's that look like?
Yeah, so the majority of players get drafted in high school, so they're year 12 years. So usually 17, 18, they're drafted. Once they get drafted, they're only AFL footballers. So we don't have academies as such. When I say we don't have academies, some of the teams have academies, but you still need to draft your players out of there. So you can't have them from the age of 10 or 12 to develop them that way. So we have the draft's in November, and we'll get another 5 or 6 players that we've never met before come into the building. So once they're with us from 18, they're purely AFL. Before that, they generally might play one or two other sports. Could be basketball, could be cricket, but they'll generally now, as opposed to when I was younger, where I was trying to play two. Most of them will probably focus on one sport a bit earlier, but they'll play others more recreationally rather than trying to make it.
It's interesting. We're obviously learning quite a bit here from AFL, but what have been your lessons? You mentioned about working. Obviously, cricket was your background and working in cricket as well, but also the Olympic sports. What have been some key takeaways from working with those athletes as well?
Yeah, I guess first of all, from cricket, I guess, as I mentioned earlier, you're a product of your history a little bit. So being a fast bowler, I always found the more I bowled, the more resilient I felt to the demands of the game. So when I spoke before about trying to become resilient to the demands of the game, I think that's driven from me as an athlete. So knowing that the more the athlete does, in theory, as long as you get there in a safe manner, so you should be able to handle that. So that's one of my philosophies, is try and make sure they're resilient through high training load. So that I've learned that from cricket. From track cycling, it's a great sport from our point of view because it's so prescriptive. So you know that if you can produce this much power with this much drag, you go this fast. So it's almost a formula. So probably the thing I learned from that is getting involved with them in 2017. We had 3 years to the Olympics, which turned into four because Tokyo got delayed for a year. So we had 3 years at the time, and all the head coach wanted for me is to get this athlete as big and strong as possible. So what it taught me is that having a long-term strategic goal, how important that was. Again, as we spoke about before, for EPL, you can't do that. But for track cycling, it was amazing how I've been so caught up in the week to week of winning and losing that it seems like the biggest thing. Like for the first year or so, when we're trying to put muscle on these guys, they were going slower than they'd ever gone. They were almost worst in the world. And then I kept saying to the coach, "Well, you're sure we're on the right path here? Sure on the right path?" He goes, "Yeah, it's a long-term view. We know that Olympic qualifying doesn't start for another year. Let's just try and get this guy the next 12 months, literally, as to put muscle mass on this guy." So I was going totally against things that I thought from a physiological point of view. So we're doing slow eccentric training, we're doing blood flow restriction, all these type of things to build muscle mass. Whereas in my head, I'm thinking you just need to lift heavy and move fast to increase strength and power. So we flipped it on its head for 12 months. And then once Olympic qualification started, then we changed and we switched it. And then we got to the Olympics in we probably had the best rider in the world leading into the Olympics. So unfortunately, the race didn't pan out and we still won a silver. But I guess what it taught me is the difference between long-term strategic outlook and a short-term week-to-week outlook. So trying to distinguish between those two.
I love that. Love that. And this is why we like speaking to people in other sports, because there's so many lessons to take from that. I was trying to think when you were talking, I spoke to someone quite a few episodes ago now. I can't even remember if it was on a meeting or on the podcast that spoke about a academy player being taken out of the games program, putting onto a program maybe not as extreme as that, but trying to add some muscle mass because it was a long-term project of getting them built up to be ready for first team. So I think we can relate to that sort of story just on a shorter time frame. You brought up a really good point there, was that delay in the Tokyo Olympics for the year. And it's not something that I've managed to speak to anyone about yet. But with that delay, obviously the Olympic cycle, the 4 years, everything's so precise, isn't it, to prepare for that time? How was it just to go, right, actually now it's not for another X amount of months, days, and the rest of it?
Yeah. First of all, your point about the academy, that is probably actually is pretty relevant in terms of the long-term strategic outlook about whatever age they are, 12, 13, trying to think when they are 17, 18, what the best way is to have them, playing really well at that age to give them a chance. So it's actually a really good point when you make it. That mightn't be as relevant to the EPL and the championship, but maybe for that, it might be more relevant.
Just to add to that, Matt, as well, sorry to cut you off, but what they mentioned at the time was that it was a very technical player. So, in terms of their technical skill, it was high. And also,
Yeah.
their game time had been very high as well. So, they saw it as a real opportunity to go, actually, this player's covered all these games, they're technically at a good level, but physically, we need to try and increase it. So, it was a real opportunity to take advantage of.
Yeah, that's a good point because the athlete that we were trying to put muscle on is a Malaysian guy, and Malaysians aren't anywhere as big as the Aussies or the Brits or the Dutch. So we had to try and spend as much time as we could to put muscle on this guy. So it sounds like, whereas technically he's the best rider in the world, so it sounds pretty similar. Now, in terms of the 12-month delay, we're actually really worried about it because our guy was 32 at the Tokyo Olympics, which is old for a track sprinter. So he was riding the best shape of his life. He won bronze medal in Rio, which was in 2016 as a 28-year-old. So we thought, right, this is his last chance. And then by having it delayed 12 months, we're really worried about it. So we had everything right, had his training right, all that type of stuff, and then it gets changed really late. So it was a worry. So rather than trying to chase any other physical parameters or anything, we just tried to hold him where he was. We gave a bit of a taper, and then sometimes with these guys, you think they're flying for the Olympics, which they are, but sometimes they're riding just as well 3 or 4 months after the Olympics. Sometimes that training's actually got a residual effect. So we almost used that theory to hold him over for 12 months. So we took him down for a bit. We didn't go through a whole massive training block, but what we had done over that last couple of years is we trialed a few different tapers and a few different builds for the World Championships because there's qualifying events along the way. So you're not just building up for one event. You need to build up the qualifying events to get enough points to qualify. So we'd had probably 2 or 3 different builds along the way that we knew what really worked. So we did a mini taper, a mini build to try and get back up for the Olympics. And he actually he rode as well as he's ever ridden in the Olympics. Unfortunately, the race didn't quite pan out the way he wanted to. There was no fault of his own or physically. It was just the way that tactically it was ridden. So that's how we pretty much did it. We had a couple of experiments along the way to get him there. And then we almost went back and more, right, which one worked really well? We've got 6 months. Which one fits into our 6 month window?
Oh, it's really interesting. Really interesting. It's something that we didn't get the chance to speak to anyone about that. So I wanted to see what people's views were on it because obviously it's such a big change, isn't it? You feel like you're prepping for a certain time and then suddenly it's whisked away and like, actually, you've
Yeah.
got another
Well,
12.
and that was a worry because he was 32. He's
Yeah.
going to be 30, 33 by the time the Olympics came. So in our head, we're thinking that's 12 months of extra aging he's going to get, whereas competitors are 24, 25. They've got an extra 12 months to actually get better. So that was our big worry. But in the end, it actually worked out okay for us.
No, that's really interesting. But I wanted to talk as well about the roles that you've experienced in the AFL because in again looking at the Premier League and Football League as well, we've seen a growth of sort of directors, performance directors. Well, across football, we can talk about performance directors coming in as well. But can you sort of talk to us about that role? Has that always been the case in in the AFL, or has that been developed over the last few years? And what does that involve?
So it's been around for a while. It would have been around for probably 10 to 15 years in the AFL. So the AFL is a bit different to a certain degree because you've got a salary cap for players, but you've also got what they call a soft cap for footy department spending. So that tells clubs how much they can spend on their staff, basically on their footy department, everything to do with the club accepts player wages. So we're really restricted in terms of how much we can spend as a footy department. I think at the moment it's about $8 million. So you've got $8 million you can spend for all staff wages, plus all things like travel, uniforms, foods, all those type of things. So it's pretty restrictive in terms of what you can spend. And pre-COVID, it was about 9.5 million. So it's still less than what it was pre-COVID. So we have to be pretty strategic as to how we spend our money. So in terms of a performance director's role, it's been around for a while. There is slight different ones. So Some clubs had a bit more of a flat structure, which I was at the Bulldogs. So at the Western Bulldogs, I was head of physical performance, and we had a head of medical, which we sat side by side. Whereas now at the Eagles, I oversee medical as well. So I oversee medical nutrition, a bit of performance analytics as well. So there is slightly different ones. Generally, of the 18 clubs, it's probably the majority would be more of a performance director. Well, there's probably still 4 or 5 that are more of a flatter structure with a head of performance and also a head of medical.
And that's kind of what we see now, Jordan, isn't it? With a lot of clubs that's taking that similar sort of structure.
Yeah, and I think again, the more time we spend as an MDT, I think it's going to allow that blending of the top role. Where people are, and we spoke with previous people we've had on the podcast and stuff. People aren't just sticking in their lane, if you want to call it that. Now people are crossing over. People are doing a sports therapy degree and then a master's in S&C, or physio and then S&C, or the other way around if they can. This sort of thing. So I think we're now getting practitioners with more knowledge, and more generally spread as well. So it's allowing for somebody to sit at the top, if you like, who can bring everyone together. Don't get me wrong, I don't know which is the better one. I don't know. But I definitely think having that more general spread of having somebody who understands a little bit of everything to a good enough detail does allow then you to fully bring everyone together. Because we know sometimes there is always a little clash. Medical, physical performance, are they ready? They're not. We want to push them, we want to hold them, all that sort of stuff. So I definitely think that's the way it's evolving. It's interesting to hear the AFL, but again, comes back to long-term strategy and vision, like we spoke about before. If you are in a department for a long, long time and you're allowed to implement that strategy and vision, it's going to have a better result than if that department is chopping and changing. It's a revolving door.
Yeah, exactly. It's having alignment across the departments, isn't it? And making sure that everyone, as we were talking about before, that everyone's buying into the direction of the football department. And it's not just our area; it's like coaching where you can, if that can all align to the same direction. So I think having experience both. I think there's definitely positives and negatives with both. With the current structure we've got now, I guess it comes down to if you have got a bit of a disagreement on a return to play timeline or something, at least now we know that it's pretty much there's one person that is ultimately responsible for the decision making. Whereas sometimes when you have two people on an even keel, you're almost relying on those two getting along. If they don't get along, then it can create issues. If they get along really well, then there won't be a problem.
I think we've heard stories of both sides of that as well, where things have been smooth and then not so smooth as well. But in terms of the attributes in that role, Matt, like for you, what was your experience on that? Like, where were the points that you felt like you needed to develop to thrive in that role? Was there anything? Because obviously there's more leadership involved. There's slightly different skills to being, I suppose, like more of the technician involves on the grass day to day. What were some of the things that you saw were really important for yourself, and then also just advice for others looking to be in that sort of role as well?
Yeah, I had it described to me once as it's a profession within a profession. So you start out as a really good physio or a really good doctor or strength and conditioning coach, sports science, whatever your background is, and there's no, they all come from different backgrounds. So whatever your previous role was, you've moved into a new role now. So it's about having, you're a profession within that original profession you were in. So I went from at the Western Bulldogs, where I was a strength and conditioning coach, and I got thrust into the role halfway through a season. So it was actually a pretty good, having that flat structure at the Bulldogs at the time was really good because it gave me someone who I really trusted from a medical point of view. I didn't have to worry so much about the medical side. So, and I had 8 or 9 years there where myself and the head of medical worked really closely together. I learned more about the medical side of things as I was in that role. I didn't need to manage it. And I was at a club where I knew the foundation, knew the structure, knew it all. So when I went to a new club, I guess I was really comfortable in my role. And then all I had to do was learn about the club. So I wasn't trying to learn a new club, a new role, learn how to manage medical, learn how to manage nutrition. I'd done all that previously. So then it was just about getting to know the new club. So I guess in terms of what's the advice, it's you almost need to let go because it's not for everyone. So some people love being on the gym floor, some people love being at the pitch all the time. If that's what you love, like this role is not for everyone. Some people just love being a practitioner. So I guess part of it is you need to know that you're no longer the guy in the gym all the time, or you might be depending on the structure, but in my role, I'm not. So you need to trust the people underneath you. Sometimes I see people who have gone from a certain role into this role, they still feel like they're in the previous role where you're not. So it's about how you can actually let go of that. You still need to provide guidance for these people, but it's how you can let go to a certain degree and let them do their role.
I think that's a really good point, isn't it? Because I think in terms of looking at maybe salary or just general sort of ambitions, you look to the top, don't you? Or majority of people do. So they're like, right, where can I end up? But I think it's a really
Yeah,
important point, isn't it, to say that like it isn't where everyone should be, and can't be either, because there's only so many positions. So I think it's really
yeah,
important, but it's also, I suppose, questioning your skill set, isn't it? We've talked
yeah,
about it
that's right.
in first team and academy coaches that some people in academies are so good developing players that it's kind of a waste of their talent to then go and work with a first team that's more about
Yeah,
performance and results.
yeah,
Keep them in the academy setting, hopefully reward them like salary wise, which I know is another debate. But to take them out of that, it's like you're so good at that that we're missing it when we take you to this. So I suppose it's the same sort of
yeah.
thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's exactly the same. So we've all seen really good practitioners, whether that's really good strength and conditioning coaches, really good physios, whatever it is, and then you move into a role and you're no longer in the gym, you're no longer in the physio's room as much, so you're losing what you're doing there, and then you're doing more management or more leadership, and you mightn't be a good manager or a good leader. So you're actually doing something totally different to what you're good at. So I guess the other part to it, in terms of advice, it's think about where you want to be in 2 years' time, and don't wait till you're there. Actually think, well, what are the gaps in what I need to do between now and then to be prepared for it. So as an example, I'm doing my MBA at the moment. So you do your MBA now because potentially another year or two, I might be in more of a director of football role, or who knows? I'm not saying I will be, but you might be. So rather than waiting till you're in that leadership role to actually learn leadership, I try and find ways to be exposed to it before you get there, because it does two things. It actually says, yeah, either yeah, I want to do this or I don't, or when you do get the role, you've actually prepared for it. You haven't just been thrown into it because you're a good S&C coach.
When you were a player, Matt, did you see yourself as a leader then? Was that something that like naturally you did as a player, or is that something you've really had to work hard at?
I think I was, even when I was a young player. So when I was still playing in the off season, a couple of years, I went to the Australian Institute of Sport. So we had the cricket academy over here. So I went there when I was 22 and 23 and worked with some of the young fast bowlers there to help them from a coach. Again, this was cricket coaching though. It wasn't so much the performance side of things, but guys like Mitchell Johnson and Ben Hilfenhaus, who ended up playing, Ryan Harris, who played for Australia, was actually helping coach them when they were only a year or two younger than me, but I was actually helping coach them. So I think from a leadership point of view, it's something I've always been interested in.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, John, isn't it? Because again, we've had people on the podcast that are now in positions of leadership position, but they've said similar to Matt in a way that it's very different to the challenges they faced beforehand.
Yeah, and I know people who have got into those leadership positions at clubs and stuff, and you speak to them and you say, I do miss being on the grass, or I do miss being in the gym a little bit. So some really good points in terms of having to sort of switch mindsets. But also, I think Matt alluded to a point as well that it's not for everyone. I think you said as well, Ben, in terms of it's almost about being true to yourself, like we've spoken about previously a long time ago, in terms of having proper youth developers and people who are really good at developing youth. Like you said, can go into a first team environment. It's like, yeah, they can do it, but we know they're better suited to there. Now, obviously, if that person wants to go and work in first team, by all means. But if you know, I'm really good on the grass, I'm really good in the gym, I'm a really good youth developer, it's almost having the bravery that if a club says we've got an opening here, it's probably not because the club are going, oh, we think you'd be the best person for this role. It's probably thinking we can fill that quite quickly and we might not need to put it out to advert or whatever it might be. There's probably some reason for it. being true and going, actually, no, thank you, but I love this role and I love what I'm doing, and being brave to kind of say, actually, this is the right role for me. And I think that's an important point as well, because like Matt was saying, leadership, it isn't for everyone. Some people might, they just love being a coach. They just love being in the gym and the vibe it gives them and the environment and all that sort of stuff. And then if you then ask to go and manage a team of, say, 6 people from different backgrounds and all different walks of life, it can be a bit of a culture shock. But the point Matt said there, in terms of if that's something you want to do, prepare yourself for it. And that, what I love is that, and I'm glad you said that, Matt, because what we always try and bang on about is for students to try as early as you can get experience of something for 2 years' time, 1 year time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time, where it might be. But that goes all the way up, doesn't it? You don't stop developing, you don't stop learning. So you, like you say in there, you're preparing yourself for what's next, even at your stage of your career. So I think that's a really, really important point. And then final question, really, for me to finish this massive ramble off is what other directions do you think your sport and AFL is going to go now? Because in football and the Premier League and stuff, we're seeing a massive rise in data, AI, all this sort of stuff. We spoke about it a lot with Martin Bouchard and stuff, and how things are changing. Do you see, is it a similar thing going on in AFL?
There is, like, the technology point of view. So player tracking, they're always talking about, we still wear GPS. Let's talk about player tracking, whether they'll revolve or evolve from wearables or move into more video based. They're now experimenting with a chip in the ball for goal line technology. I'm sure you would have seen that type of stuff. So there's a lot of that type of thing in terms of technology. I think it's in terms of the player data and the data we're getting, it's, I think, using it better. So we've went through a stage where we're trying to gather everything, and now we're probably gathering less, but trying to make sure what we gather is important. It will come back around to when we can actually process all that data. I'm sure we will start to gather more at some stage. Until we get better at working out what we do with the data, that's probably the thing. I think the AFL is also growing. There's the women's games becoming more and more. So I think those type of things. I think there'll just be more resources put around the women's game. The clubs will grow. Again, as I mentioned before about the caps on how much you can spend, they'll have to find better ways to spend that money. So by doing that, I think your point around AI, data analytics, that type of stuff, they'll try and have to be smarter with how they actually use their funds and collect their data and use it, I suppose.
There's a lot of similarities there, isn't there? No, it's been fascinating, this, Matt. I think because to get an insight from what you're dealing with in your position with your athletes, the demands of the sport is really fascinating. But there's still a lot of similar challenges that coaches are facing across both sports as well, across a number of sports as well. So no, it's been amazing to get that insight. So I really appreciate you coming on and talking through it, because I think the listeners will take a hell of a lot from that. Jordan, any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
No, just, yeah, again, massive thanks for coming on. And I'll be watching the AFL results now, and having a look at how to get on.
No, Matt, thank you very much. And just finish us up. If people have got any questions or anything, do you have anywhere that they could reach out? Where's the best place?
To me,
Yeah.
Also, I don't know what's the best. Is it LinkedIn? What do we normally do?
Yeah, whatever you use. I mean, if
Yeah.
you LinkedIn, obviously there's all the social channels, but I know some people use them, some people don't. So whatever's best for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, I'll use LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, but I'm not very active on it, but I do check it. So yeah, they're probably the two ways, I suppose. You get me?
Perfect. Perfect. No, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. And a big thank you to Jerome as well. Jerome Peters was recommended to get you on the podcast, and you fully delivered. So thank you very much to Jerome as well.
No, thanks. It's been good. Love chatting.
Thank you, mate.
Cheers.
Jordan, it's been a little while since we got a point of view from a different sport. I thought that was really refreshing, wasn't it? But there was so much to take away from that one in terms of how they operate in the AFL as well.
Yeah, I think the major points for me was that shock horror, if you're allowed time in a role, you can really get some good detail done. You can listen to your staff, you can implement better things than if you rushed and just concentrate on week to week. No surprise, to be honest. The actual physical demands that ties in, this ties in as well. The physical demands of AFL and what the players are going through. Again, shock horror if they perform really, really hard at the weekend and they're allowed time to recover, they can go again. There's a lot of things there that as if you're a practitioner in the Premier League or in the EFL, you're going, oh, I'd love that. Can you imagine 6, 7, 8 day lead-ins to every game? I think the other really important one for me was the salary caps and the money caps on staff departments as well. I think that would really change things. Let's face it, the genie's out the bottle with the Premier League and the AFL. Like we know that certain clubs that have unlimited budgets essentially and can just have a role for every department. Now we spoke about it again with on the Portsmouth podcast when we were talking about having slightly smaller departments allows better integration. But if you're a club and you know you've only got X amount to spend on a department, you've got to be really savvy with how you spend that. And it's almost like you if you've got a potential fluffy role that you're thinking, yeah, we could do with one of those. It'll take a little bit of a job burden of those, but realistically, that person could do that job, and we wouldn't need an extra one. Then departments would go, no, we don't need that. This is the department, and it would streamline things, and it'd be really interesting to see. You need a parallel universe for it, but if we could run an English or UK, Premier League and EFL with as it is now versus an English and UK EFL Premier League with salary caps, department has salary caps as well, and see the difference. That'd be really, really interesting. But so many points in there. And again, leadership qualities, soft skills, actual technical detail. I think so good. So excellent episode.
Yeah, I was going to bring up some of the soft skills stuff. So when you mentioned about the honesty, but with compassion, I thought that was really, really key because like we mentioned, you don't want to be too far either side on that. And that's obviously what related to him as a player as well. That was one of the challenges from that transition. The small conversations regularly, I really loved. I think that's really important because he said it makes the bigger conversations when you need those bigger conversations a bit easier because you've got that relationship. Another obvious one, but I think it's just one of those, isn't it? That maybe you question that when you get to the end of the day, right? Did it get round everyone? Was there opportunities that I missed that I could have maybe caught up with that person? I chose to do something else instead because that was maybe, like I said, a missed opportunity that in the future, is that going to come back to bite me a little bit? And then the next day, right, I didn't catch up with that person on Monday. So Tuesday, let's make sure that's a priority to get with them. So I think that they're really important. And the other ones was going into the new organization of having your philosophy and seeing the areas that you can work on, but matching it with theirs. And obviously Matt talked about an occasion where they did match up. And it was one thing that I should maybe put to him to say that what was the idea if they didn't. But there was obviously it was highlighted that there was similar sort of things going on that he could work on and then bringing that together, but also bringing up the risks. I thought was a really good point because it might be seen as a negative, but you're essentially setting a full plan to say, right, this is what we're trying to aim for. These are the risks. If these things happen, this is what we're going to do. And he mentioned, didn't he, about having the meetings with the performance department. And once they leave the meeting, they all know what they're going to tackle when they're speaking to other staff members. And I think that's really important. It's like you're getting all your Avengers together. Yeah. you're going out to battle when you know what you're trying to battle against. And I think it's such a good point. I thought there was loads in that, and I really, really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed recording that one.
Yeah, and I think overall the similar themes, don't they, in terms of collaboration, but cohesion, and then you leave the room with a single point in mind.
Yeah.
So really good. Yeah, very, very good episode. Very, very worthwhile in terms of some of the detail in there. So I'll be listening back to that one, I think, as well.
Awesome. So that's 310 in the books. We have got some good ones coming up as well. So just a little thank you as well. We're getting loads of really good shares still over on the socials, especially LinkedIn. So please keep them going because it's really good to see, and it gives us some really good insights into what you're taking away from the episodes. And then just last bit on the sponsors, make sure to go and follow the sponsors, Rezel, Good Prep and Hydro. Go and give them a follow at least on socials. I know some of you use them already and they're doing some amazing work and they make this podcast run the way it does. So big thank you to them and big thank you to you, Jordan, as well.
No, loved it as always.
Cheers, mate.
See you later.